Order the Diversion Authority Land Management Committee meeting to order this Wednesday, January 27th, 2021. Do we have a quorum, Don?
We do have a quorum, Mrs. Shirley.
Thank you. Then you have before you the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda? Or a motion to approve?
So moved, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Brightling, second.
Thank you. All those opposed say aye. Moving on to item number 3, the minutes of the previous meetings. There were 2, December 16th and January 7th. Are there any additions or corrections to either of those meeting minutes?
Olson, motions to approve.
Thank you, Roger. Is there a second?
Brightling, seconds.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All opposed, say aye. Great. So on to item number 4 is the property acquisition status report you have in your packet. Eric, do you want to go through that?
Yes, Commissioner Shirley, thank you, and board members, good to see you again. Committee members, I guess that is. In your packet, starting on page 2 of the, on page 6 of the packet report is the acquisition status report. I guess Tammy has the screen up on page 7, which is the overall map. As you may have expected, we've made a bunch of progress in the last month and continue to move forward. As you see in the legend there on the map, we have acquired just about 500 parcels, voluntarily acquired almost 500 parcels, and we have had to use an eminent domain process on about 93 at the time that this report was developed. So you can see the color-coded status of that along the channel. We have nearly everything acquired. At the time that this was prepared, there's a few parcels that are shown in blue, which means we're still negotiating. We do anticipate having the final purchase agreement for those parcels signed later this week. And that information has been conveyed in the final RFP for the P3 developer. So happy to report it, a lot of progress, and I think we've met the milestones established for getting the channel lands in hand before the P3 developer submits their bids. You will note there is a number of red colored parcels along the channel, and some of them south and east of Horace. Those are parcels where unfortunately we have not been able to reach this voluntary agreement, and so we have had to file an eminent domain action. We are continuing to negotiate where possible with those property owners and anticipate several of them being converted from an eminent domain action into a voluntary action. And so I guess that progress will continue, and I'm expecting the number of green parcels to go up and the number of red parcels to probably trickle down over the next several months. Might also just point out, you see the sort of camel hump area of the project in Stanley Township. You see a lot of blue. That's an area where we're working on appraisals for the Drain 27 wetland restoration project. Those appraisals are being reviewed. Most of them will be reviewed tomorrow at the Cass County Joint Board, and then offers will be presented to those property owners. We are also working on appraisals for the Red River control structure, and so you can see some colored shaded parcels around that area. Otherwise, the remainder of the report, I guess, Tammy, if you can go to the next page, shows a map of environmental monitoring easements. I think we've talked about this some in the past, but just as a reminder, there's just under 400 parcels scattered across the region where we need to acquire an easement for monitoring of environmental conditions for the next 50 years. Over half of those have been acquired, and we're getting appraisals back on the remaining 160 some parcels. Anticipate having all of those appraisals back next month, and then offers will be made to those property owners shortly thereafter. The remaining pages of the report drill into more detail about each one of these sections, and I guess I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Oh, I think you're on mute, Commissioner Shirley.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions? And are we on time and on budget?
We are on time and we are on budget. You can see in the status report that we do have some budget indications. Everything seems to be coming in as expected or under, and so we're happy to report that.
Wonderful. And where are we at with Crown Appraisals now?
Sure. So Crown Appraisals was hired by the, Tammy, if you roll up a couple pages. Right there, that's good. Go to the upstream area, Tammy, if you will, just as a discussion point. So Crown Appraisals was hired by the Diversion Authority back in 2017 to do the phase 1 study. If you recall, just recently, the Diversion Board approved a task order for phase 2, which is putting an actual easement value on over 500 parcels in the upstream area. Those 500 parcels contain tillable land. And so Crown has gotten, they're getting started on that study. We've supplied them a tremendous amount of information about those parcels. We continue to gather some additional information that they will need. And I'm looking forward to continue working with them right now. The current schedule indicates that they will be done with that valuation study later this year, probably in the fourth quarter of this year. And we look forward to getting those results back and eventually visiting with property owners about easement values.
Okay, thanks. A lot of information there. Does anybody have any questions for Eric?
Yeah, Commissioner Sherling, I do, if I could. This is Bob.
Please. And who is this?
It's Bob. Bob Zimmer.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. I'm looking at the diversion channel bar chart with the budget. This is just a curiosity question more than anything. So obviously the negotiation parcels are not shown in the budget as part of what's been spent, but are the green is, the red is or isn't?
The red is included in the budget spent to date.
Okay.
And I guess, thanks for bringing that up, Bob. If the group, would prefer to see that as a red shaded portion of the bar or something different, we can certainly do that. In the last month, there's been almost $19 million worth of deposits made on, court-ordered actions. And so not all of those are in the channel, of course. There's some of them on Southern Embankment Reach 1, but a significant amount of dollars have been deposited with the court for those eminent domain actions. And those values are included in the spent amount here.
Yeah, I was just curious as to, I don't think we've had that large a number show up like that in a previous report. So I'd just clarify that was actually in what was spent. So thanks, Eric.
Yep, you bet.
Thank you for clarifying that. Anyone else? Okay. Well, let's move on then to item number 5. We want to give that as much time as we can or need to at any rate. That would be the policy on the disposition and management of excess land. And Martin, I believe you're going to take this one. Is that correct?
I will provide, yes, Madam Chair, I will provide some introductory comments, and then it'll be to the committee as to how they want to walk through this or have had a chance to see it. So what you have in front of the Land Committee this week is a draft policy on the disposition and management of comprehensive project excess lands. So in general, it is a document that was started by John Shockley, and then had a what I would call a small team get it to the point where it was ready for broader input and discussion. And I think in the last meeting, Madam Chair, we had a conversation that it really is the land committee that has to be comfortable with this before it goes to the board. So I want to represent this as a draft document. It is by no means perfect. It's by no means final, and ready for some good discussion and evaluation by this committee. Tammy Jo, are you the one running the screen? If you could go down to section 1.5, it contains kind of the guiding principles that are included in the policy. There's 4 primary principles. One is to refrain from selling land at less than market value, and market value is defined in the document. Secondly, it provides a preference to prior landowners. Third, a preference to adjacent property owners. And fourth, eventually sell or exchange all excess lands at a time when it is in the best interests of the authority to do so. I won't get into comments on each one of those. I think I'll let the committee go through some questions and some dialogue. The folks who have seen this in the past include Roger and Mary on the Lands Committee, and some input by some other electeds, Mayor Mahoney, Mayor Dardis, and I think that was, and Mayor Judd. But no further discussion or input from others, essentially, than that small group. So, as I said, this isn't perfect and isn't done. Just to kind of scroll through, Tammy, if you will, the definitions are included in section 2. There are some base responsibilities that are largely founded in the JPA and the other documents that form the responsibilities of the member entities. The key principles are repeated there in 4 with a little more detail, and how that might work with in terms of preference to sell to the adjacent landowner in 4.5. And with respect to leases, it does cover leasing ag land to the prior farm operator and then to the adjacent farm operator as a second. And then if that doesn't go, it goes to the general public. There is a section on mitigation for impacted owners, which primarily allows the kinds of activities that were approved at the last special board meeting, which was a sale or exchange, which was in the best interests of the authority to do so. If you go to section 6, there you go. It also does cover renting and leasing. So there are 2 categories of rental type property. One is non-ag land, which outlines the process to basically do that, offer that to the public and have a public process for that at a market rate. And then if you go to 6.2, from a farmland perspective, it goes through the preferences of prior farm operator and then adjacent farm operator and then to the public. Section 7 covers the unsolicited proposals. From time to time, the Diversion Authority is approached by parties who want to access Diversion Authority land, and that basically sets out that it would be analyzed and evaluated, and then go through purchase or lease intent from one or more third parties if it's released to the public, essentially, to make sure that process is competitive and it's not a sole source to proposals. Section 8 includes impacted owners, which is the...
Excuse me.
Yes.
There's a term member entity in 711. Can you tell me what that means?
The member entities are those that make up the Diversion Authority. So that would be the Cass County Joint Water Resource District, the MCC JPA.
Martin, it's John. Actually, the MCC JPA is not a member entity.
That's correct. Sorry.
The term member entity comes out of the JPA. That includes the City of Fargo, City of Moorhead, Clay County, Cass County, and the Cass County Joint Water Resource District. And we tried to utilize the same terminology that was utilized in the Joint Powers Agreement for consistency.
Yep.
Sorry, Martin.
Thank you. No, thank you for not. I was headed to Minnesota, but I headed into the wrong part of Minnesota. No chuckles. Okay, we'll go on. Section 8, I think I was starting on, which is the impacted owner section, which considers the ability for the diversion authority to utilize lands that it owns to help mitigate the impact of the project on others, and that could be an exchange transaction or something similar to what you approved at your last meeting. Then in section 9, you've got, again, these, John's probably best to go through these. These are the transaction requirements that come out of, partially out of the JPA and others. Transparency and open records in 10, and then an intent in 11 that talks about the protection of public interest. And in 12, the intent basically to try and continue to generate revenue in the form of taxes unless approved otherwise by the board. So with that, I'll consider that kind of a very high level run through, and Madam Chair, I'll turn it back to you for facilitated discussion.
Thank you. So I don't know how we want to go through this, but I would really encourage everyone to give us some input on this. I want to make sure that we have an opportunity before we move this forward to the DA board for final approval, that it's been thoroughly vetted. The intention, I think, here is that we would not hang on to land. That's not the purpose of the DA. We want to use what we need and turn back the rest, get it back into production. And so we have this policy that, first and foremost, we would offer that back to the original landowner. And then you can see that we also have put in here a preference to adjacent property owners. And that's perhaps something we need to talk about. Is that appropriate in all circumstances? So keep that in mind. One thing that was brought to my attention just today actually was 4.1, that is the authority's intent that all excess land will eventually be sold or exchanged when it's at the best interest of the authority to do so. I wonder if we should add or member entity there, just in case, for example, Cass or Clay counties wanted to retain a strip along a roadway for some sort of improvement. There's been conversation about a bypass around the metro area. Maybe we want to have a little more wiggle room there for those member entities. So I'm throwing that out. Any reaction to that?
Commissioner, Chair Shirley,
Yes.
One comment about that you may want to consider is if a member entity were to retain the property for a public project that they're working on, we'll just use the joint board for instance, would you want the joint board to reimburse the authority for that? It's sort of like a sale, but kind of different, because right now the diversion authority dollars are being used to pay for the land, and it's just something to think about as you're thinking through that process.
Sure. I think the idea is that we wouldn't want to sell the land and then have to go back and take it again, since we already have it, or at least somebody has it. So, yeah, I guess I don't know how the details would flow out there, but if we put in some sort of language that would allow for that down the road.
Madam Chair, this is Commissioner Brightling. There is, from time to time on acquisitions that are negotiated and completed, there are sometimes the right of first refusal for the former owner. Is there anything in this draft that would be inconsistent with that? Or is there a need to address those types of situations more specifically?
I think that's a great question, and maybe John can answer that. I don't know that it's in all of those purchase agreements, but John, do you have the answer?
Yeah, so it is in a majority of the purchase agreements. It was something the legislature wanted us to include, that they would have the first right of refusal. That was primarily driven towards, the contingency if for whatever reason the project didn't move forward, that those property owners would have a chance to repurchase the property. I think we've tried to express that condition in 4.4, where we talk about a preference to sell the excess land to the prior landowner, where we say first preference should be given. We could certainly clarify that to say consistent with any first rights of refusal.
And John, I think there's another section, 5.1.2.1. Tammy, if you could go there. So it is subject to any conditions in the original transfer of the excess land to the authority, which would be that original purchase agreement and whatever rights of first refusal were included in that document. The intent was to honor those, not to supersede them.
Thank you.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
Roger here. There's been talk of keeping ownership of some of the land in the Camel Hump area because of the excess or the possibility of frequent flooding in that area. And so do you think that's addressed in 4.1? Would that land be considered part of the project? It says here we're going to get rid of all excess land.
Well, and I don't know who wants to jump in here, Eric or Martin, but the intention I think should be to get rid of the land, and maybe maybe there's obviously we're going to put the flowage easements on this property, and if it's going to with the disclosure of how wet it's going to be, we sell it, and it maybe is not going to fetch as good a price as other parcels that are further down south. I've always been told that we wouldn't have a big threat of a summer event, so I don't know how much that flood insurance is going to cost. Would it make any difference if we put drain tile in there? Maybe that would be cost effective. I don't know, but I personally would not like to see us hang on to this land any longer than we need it. That's my feeling, but you can always convince me otherwise.
Yeah, Madam Chair, and Tammy, if you could go to 2.6. So, Commissioner Olson, your question, I think, is handled in the definition of excess land, which is lands owned that have been declared by the executive director as no longer needed for the construction, operation, use, maintenance, or mitigation of the comprehensive project. So I think to the extent that a member entity thinks that this particular piece of land still has value to the authority for those purposes, And mitigation would be one to mitigate costs of flowage easements or whatever form that might take. It doesn't have to be declared excess land, and it wouldn't fall into the policy. So I don't think there's a requirement to sell land by a specific date, but I do think, back to the guiding principles and what Chairman Sherling has said. I think the intent is that the Diversion Authority wouldn't be in the land business, they're in the flood control business, and to the extent that this land isn't needed for construction, operation, use, maintenance, or mitigation, it would be disposed of. So it does provide quite a bit of flexibility. The process would be that member entities would, and as I said in my opening remarks, it's meant to be administered by the executive director. So the executive director is the administrator of the policy and the screening for, is this land necessary or not? What's our strategy for managing and mitigating? When it's no longer useful for any of that, it falls into this policy and gets sold. Doesn't mean all of it has to.
Okay, thanks, Martin.
Mary, you're muted.
Thank you. I had a question about 12.1, talking about generating revenue for the applicable county in the form of taxes. Should that be local taxing authority rather than just county? Or is that the intention? I'm thinking schools and.
Yeah, we could certainly clarify that. The reason that I used county is that the county normally collects the taxes and distributes it out to the taxing jurisdictions, but I could certainly clarify that it would be for all the taxing jurisdictions.
Okay.
Yeah,
Because
I
that
had
has been a criticism.
I had a question on that one too. I think
a concern from school districts is making sure that they maintain their taxing, their support. So, Jenny, did you have something?
I was saying that I agreed with that comment. I think it gets tricky when you add in, local HRAs or watershed ditches that are part of those tax statements. So it is cleaner to say county, but.
And I'm fine either way, just so it doesn't hinder us in any way from making the point that it's not just county property taxes that we're collecting. Okay. How about number 3? Provide preference to adjacent property owners. There's been some discussion about that, and there is property, we've been talking primarily farmland, but there is property in town too. And perhaps this is not the appropriate language that would suit that. Anybody?
Madam Chair?
Yes.
Bruce Grubb here. That was the comment that I was going to make is the preferences. I understand the logic behind that in town. And I think Nathan's on and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're required by ordinance to offer that up for public sales. So Nathan, are you there? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bruce. That's correct. So when I read through this from a Fargo perspective, there's various components of the policy that do contradict the city's ordinance, and we have different requirements we have in place that we have to follow in order to sell any city-owned property, and provide preference to prior landowners unless it's specifically spelled out in the purchase agreement, which I believe the properties owned in the city are not, as well as preference that adjacent property owners are something that we just unfortunately cannot do. That would be against our ordinance. And I think since these properties are downtown as well, you know, the city wants to make sure that we keep, you know, the global view of what would be the best for the city long-term for what gets developed on those as well. So we would definitely want to open it up to the entire market for selling these remnant parcels.
Sure, and that makes total sense. I think when we were really crafting this, we were just thinking about farmland. But obviously, if we've bought somebody out in downtown Fargo and they've reestablished their business somewhere else, they wouldn't get a right of first refusal, I wouldn't think, on the previously owned parcels. So I think unless somebody has an objection, I think that would make total sense. I don't know that, you know, it's nice if we can be consistent. We've got Clay County and Moorhead engaged here too, so I don't know how consistent we can be across all member entities, but this is one that I'd like to see us try to be consistent with. Any input there, Martin or John or Eric? Or
I think we can, Madam Chair, I think we can make some adaptations to the policy to carve out in-town parcels that are owned that would be put up for sale. I don't have any specific page off the top of my head right now, but
sure.
Do you have any comments?
I'm just wondering. Nathan or Bruce, are there any other, you said that there were several inconsistencies. Anything else we should be looking at?
Well, I just wanted, the only other thing that came to my mind was making sure that, you know, we have all the available tools to be able to sell the property to it, not just listing it or through an auction, but also if we decide to go through an RFP process, that is an available tool as well. That we don't necessarily have to sell it to the highest submitted proposal, you know, because sometimes someone's long-term goal for a property might be in best interest for the city, and that might be not the highest valued proposal submitted either, you know, and that ultimately would be our city commission that would be making that decision of who to award that proposal to.
Well, I think that that's addressed to a certain degree in here, and maybe Martin, you could point us in the right direction.
Yeah, I think like all policies, they're never going to fit every single circumstance, and there's always room for exceptions. But it was anticipated in 2.16 that the public sale means the sales of excess land advertised in a certain way, or the number 3 there, other commercially reasonable means of publicly marking the specific excess land being sold. So I think it would allow some unique marketing for the specific property. Again, I think, Madam Chair, your comments earlier, this was primarily driven around ag land, but if there were other pieces of property that needed a unique sales method or had, and John will have to think about how to incorporate the ordinance requirements of the member entity. I think the policy accommodates that.
Yeah, and I would add on to what Martin said in the first part of 2.16, it does allow for the use of request for proposals as long as it's publicly sold.
Great, thank you. Anything else, Nathan or Bruce?
I would say from within the city, no, there's not.
And I guess I would ask the rest of the committee, you know, one of the things that we look at is a sliver of land that might be adjacent to a parcel versus a larger parcel of land. Any thoughts in that regard? If those should be handled differently?
Commissioner, it's Bob again.
Yes.
That was a great statement.
Yes.
That was my question. I get the vision of when we look at this policy, we're always thinking of larger tracts for farmland, but what about that 1 acre piece of land that someday when Bob retires, he's going to go buy that and live cheaply on 1 acre next to the Diversion waterfront? Are there unintended consequences for some of those parcels, I guess? And maybe that's been thought through, maybe that hasn't, and maybe there's nothing we can do, but curious about that.
Thank you, Bob. And that was kind of a concern I had because we've had issues out in the county before when there've been smaller parcels and somebody leases it and, they use it for hunting, and mudding or whatever might be. And so, I'd rather have an adjacent landowner have the opportunity to acquire that land, under a fair process. But nonetheless, I think that makes more sense. But if it's a larger parcel, then it probably would make more sense for the best interest of the DA and ultimately the taxpayer that larger parcel be put out on a public auction. So, and I would welcome you producers that are on the line here to weigh in on this. Or anyone for that matter, but please join in the conversation.
Yeah, Mary, we did have this conversation at our small working group, as you remember, and I think the issue is what size property would be better to take to auction than to offer to the adjacent landowner. And I think that might be more difficult than we think. Some of these pieces might be a little larger, but they might be odd shaped and they might fit much better with the adjacent landowner. And I think it would be hard to separate between that small piece and the irregular piece, and then at what point is 40 acres enough to sell at public auction? I think that we have the ability to set the price, and certainly we'll use Pifers to help us determine what that might be. So whether it's a small piece or a large piece, I don't think we would have too much exposure to losing money. And if the offer is below what we've been told it should be, we'll just, pull that piece of land and put it up for public auction. But I think the first move should be to the prior, second to the adjacent. And certainly when there's more than one adjacent, we will have a bidding process that'll probably be able to tell what the actual value the farmer or the landowners next to it is willing to pay. So I don't think we should try to separate it.
Okay, thank you for that. And I would just note too that the lease policy pretty much mirrors the sale policy. We have been actively farming some of this property until we have everything squared away, what exactly we're going to need And so we'll continue to do that for the first, the near term, but eventually, hopefully most of this will be gone. But the policy would be consistent, whether it's being leased or being sold. And I think that makes sense. But again, if anybody else has anything they'd like to add, please do.
So Commissioner Sherling, this is Nathan. I
Yes.
believe the definition of the adjacent landowner is that it can be separated by a public road or right of way as well. I guess I would like to understand the thought process a little bit more on, in that scenario, why we think it would be still appropriate to offer that landowner on the other side of a roadway opportunity to buy the land prior to opening it up to public.
So, Madam Chair, this is John. The reason that we included that was really driven towards farming operations. Oftentimes in the rural areas, you'll have a township road that divides, that goes between two quarters. And a lot of the egg producers, they already have their equipment on the one side, and it's easy for them to just move it over to the other side. And so that's part of the reason why we use the right of way. And then also sometimes there are drains that separate parcels, and it seemed like a logical choice. And the adjacent landowner was really driven towards the parcels out in the country, not so much in town. And we can certainly make a carve out that it wouldn't apply to parcels that are located inside of city limits.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I think we absolutely need to make that carve out for within the city, but I guess for out in the rural areas, I try to put perspective of, if I was a farmer a half a mile away from this adjacent parcel, would I be upset if I didn't get a chance to buy an adjacent piece of land, that just because there's somebody in between me and that land?
Madam Chair. Madam
Yes,
Chair?
go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, Penny.
I'm struggling a little bit with that, the adjacent landowner or farm operator, even though, in my area of the valley, it's pretty cut and dry, 1 mile section lines. You still are going to have, in some cases, a couple different farm operators that are adjacent. And, how do we determine which adjacent farm operator gets first dibs? And I appreciate the fact that we're offering that, because, there's not a lot of times when adjacent property, specifically farmland, will come up for sale. And so it is, I think, important to maintain the, maintain the makeup of what that community is, to be able to get land close by. But who's picking what adjacent landowner gets first dibs?
Well, Jenny,
Mark, you want to address that, or?
Okay, go ahead.
Tammy, if you could go to 5.1.3. So in terms of the adjacent landowner, it contemplates there could be one or multiple, depending upon the size of the parcel and the size of the adjacent parcels. The intent is to offer that to all of those adjacent landowners. And if there are multiple interested adjacent landowners, the one that offers the highest price above the market value within that 30 days is successful. So it's almost a mini bid, so to speak, with all of the adjacent landowners.
So are you giving preference to adjacent landowners to landowners that are directly abutting the property, or does that include properties across a township road as well?
Yes, Commissioner Mongu, that's subject to the definition of that adjacent landowner that Nathan was just talking about. If you could go to that definition, Tammy, it is 2.2. Yeah. So at the moment, the policy contemplates, as John described, land that abuts it, but includes lands that's separated by a public road right of way or a legal drain.
Thank you.
You know, Martin, I just want to add something too, that most of these township roads, the landowner on either side actually will touch in the middle of the road because they've only given an easement for the road, and they actually own and pay tax on the full quarter section. So they do actually touch, even though there's a road in between. I think we're being consistent with that policy where the land has to touch.
Anyone else? Well, again, this is just a draft at this point, and I think, John, you've got some work cut out to carve out in-town properties into a separate definition here. So, are you comfortable, Jenny, with the answers you've gotten regarding the adjacent land? Does that?
Yeah, that answered my question on
satisfy
that. That answered my question on that.
Okay. So Martin, you've got some instruction as well?
Yes, Madam Chair, John Shockley answered or asked a question early on that I'm not sure I have the answer to, and that was your comment on strips of land that a public entity may want to retain. John asked a question whether or not that would be done at market value and the diversion authority reimbursed by the entity. I know in some past discussions there's been concern that the land was purchased with diversion authority funds that were meant for flood control. So, having some direction from the land committee and the board on the policy of how that transaction occurs, I think probably would be helpful.
And Jenny, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to comment on that piece. I certainly feel that if an entity wants to do something like that, it should be paid for with that entity's funds.
And my guess is, for example, if we were talking bypass, that would come with, I would think, maybe state and federal funds. Maybe Nathan knows that answer, but
yeah, that would have to be leveraged with local funds, but there definitely would be federal funds if it came to that case, but I don't know how close we are on that.
Correct, but just kind of looking into the future, making sure that we have the language that we need, so that we can do that without going through too many extra hoops down the road. And maybe Jason Benson needs to be brought into that conversation a little bit too, perhaps. Anyone else? Martin, are you good?
That's always an open question, Madam Chair. I think John and I probably have enough direction to make some changes to this policy. I guess I'd want to clarify with Eric. He's been a part of this too, as anything from his perspective that we need to move this forward as well.
Hi guys, great discussion here. While I think it would be helpful to have these guardrails sort of built up, so we all know that we're operating within safe lanes of travel. But keep in mind, I guess we do have several years of experience sort of practicing farmland rentals through the joint board, and Pfeiffer's has done a really nice job for the joint board and the Diversion Authority handling that. And so I guess my thought has been that, we've generally stayed out of trouble using those practices over the last several years. And I guess I would suggest that we'll sort of continue operating as we've been operating until such time that this policy gets developed. It would be great to have this fully defined, but recognize we do have farmers who are starting to think about their spring planting operations, and we probably don't want to stand in the way of letting them proceed down those paths. If they rented something from us last year, or they were farming it last year and we recently purchased the land, for example, we've got the standard operating procedure is to go back to the prior tenant and offer them the right to farm it again this year. So.
Madam Chair?
Yes, who is that?
Tim Mahoney. Just a question to Jenny. Oftentimes when we get into this, there's a lot of farmsteads that are all around a different area, and a fairness issue always comes up. So if somebody sells completely their farm, has 1,000, 2,000 acres, and somebody wants to buy it, will it be fair if we just offer that to adjacent landowners? I mean, because I know some people want to expand, some people want to get bigger. Will the diversion be felt that, Charlie's got maybe 1,000 acres and you maybe have a bigger operation, 6,000 to 8,000 or whatever? Is it fair if we just give it to the adjacent landowner, or should it be allowed to public? Because in the city entities, we're always very careful to try and let everybody, if they want to bid on something, bid on something.
I think that's a good question. I don't think anything you will do will be without scrutiny. That's just the way it works. And I don't deal in acreages that large. Roger's more adapt to those kind of conversations. But from what I saw today, I feel like it's a fair shake.
I mean, because the small segments, I can understand it's next to you, like Roger and I talked, because you've got a triangle or you got something that's odd. It makes more sense to go to the adjacent landowner because somebody doesn't have to drive 2 to 3 miles to do it. But it's just a question, if somebody says, I'm getting out of farming, you can sell it, do with what you want. And it's bigger acreage, which is actually, farmable stuff. Are we not necessarily being fair to the farm neighborhood? So that's the only question I have.
Well, and maybe a follow-up to that, 1,000 acres. If you think about the adjacent landowners on 1,000 acres, that's pretty much the majority of some community, farm communities. And so it's really going to be offered to a large amount of folks, don't you think?
Well, the concern I have, it's rumored that Ace Brandt will buy up any land he can find. So, I mean, I don't, kind of gets to, do you want Ace Brandt to buy up all the remnants and everything, or do we want the local farmers to continue to farm the land who are neighbors and work together?
Well, I'm not going to comment on that just because of, I'm related through some family issues for Ace Brandt, so I'm not going to comment on that specifically, but, I understand where the concern may be.
Well, I'll take the name out of it. I'm just saying somebody could come from outside the area and buy it, and that just is. Do we get labeled because we didn't make it available to the local person, or that felt unfair because we didn't allow it to the quote general public? So that's all.
I think it's a great question, a great comment. I don't want to be in the business of picking winners and losers, but this one's a tough one. But I do think that if we have displaced landowners down in that area, if the more we can make people whole, the better. I don't know, Roger. Did somebody else have something to say? I thought I heard someone.
Yeah, Roger. Jenny hit it right on the nose. the bigger the piece of ground, the more adjacent landowners are going to be touching that. It's going to be a bidding process to acquire that land. And really the really irregular pieces that maybe don't even have access without the adjacent property owner being involved are really not going to have much value. And I know we talked about this, the value of hunting land being so close to Fargo, and those small pieces might be attractive to people putting up hunting preserves. And I don't think that's what we want to do. We don't want to disturb the farming population any more than what we have. And I think Mary supports that from the county. I think it would just be an issue. So I feel the adjacent landowners should have the right, and as the piece gets bigger, we're going to have more involved in the bidding. So I don't think we're going to be losing money, and I think I would stand up and take any criticism for this policy because I think it can be supported.
Thank you, Roger.
Madam Chair, I did have one comment.
Yes, John.
I just wanted to make sure that everybody is on the same page with respect to why we're having this discussion. Pursuant to section 16.10 of the Joint Powers Agreement, any sale of diversion property that's acquired for the project has to be approved by